Thank you very much for inviting me to address this conference. I'm very honored. I just want to add to the introduction and the list of all my professional careers that I am also a social worker, and I've been a social worker for 40 years, and I'm proud of that. Now, what I'm going to say today is based on a book that I have published together with my colleague Ruth Boris, who is also present at this conference. And the title is Outreach Work with Young People as a Method in Social Work, a Handbook. Just to give you a glimpse of the content for those who do not read the Danish language, it gives inspiration and concrete proposal to methods and planning and carrying out of outreach work. It gives inspiration to how to overcome the dilemmas in the work with young people who are staying in public spaces in a disproportionate manner, and it presentation of theories and concepts and perspectives on the living conditions of the young as well as the conditions of social work. Now, outreach work with young people, I think, need to take into consideration the living conditions of the young and their families. Among other things, the living conditions might be characterized by poor households, inadequate conditions of housing, unemployment, poor health condition, conflicts at home, problems and conflicts in school, conflicts at street level, processes of marginalization and social exclusion. And this is the program I was going to speak to you about today, living conditions, as you have heard. But I will focus on the indirect forms of violence, and I will talk a bit about conflict resolution and outreach work, and empowerment and outreach work. And here you have the list I just mentioned about the living condition, which might be characterized in this way. Such characteristics as those are interwoven in a matrix of mutual dependence and negative feedback loops. Some of the main forces behind the processes of marginalization and social exclusions are the forms of indirect violence. According to the esteemed Norwegian peace and conflict worker and researcher Professor Johan Galtung, you can divide forms of violence into these three different forms: the direct violence, the structural violence, and the cultural violence. Of course, a lot of you are facing the problems of direct violence in the street in your everyday work, I think. But now I want to highlight the indirect forms of violence. The peace worker Johan Galtung has also stressed that the structural and cultural violence can be even more harmful than can the direct forms of violence. And he is referring to, as an example, the millions of children dying worldwide each year out of poorness and bad health condition, that is, out of structural violence. I have made a small change to his list, and I have divided the forms of indirect violence into the structural, the cultural, and the symbolic form of indirect violence. A common definition of structural violence is that it is unintentional, harming structures within the society and systems of administration. As such, it might often be difficult to identify specific individuals carrying out this form of violence. However, there are cases of social violence where the harming, discriminatory measures are carried out in spite of knowing better, in spite of knowing the social and economic consequences of the target group, such as, for example, the implementation of structural harming measures done by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in Spain and Greece. Or, for example, national and/or local harming measures preventing shelter for certain groups of homeless people, or measures against migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. In such cases, it might be possible to identify specific individuals, that is, politicians or administrators, behind the violence, though social violence, and that is in contrast to direct violence, might seldom, if ever, be covered by the criminal law, and therefore it might not be possible to persecute those individuals carrying out the harmful measures. Structural violence can often be identified within organizational structures as such, within organizational cultures, within educational and administrative routines, and within political and legal resolutions at the national and the local level. Such structures, cultures, routine might be found within public as well as the private organization. And as I would like to mention for you, just to have something to reflect on, it might also include organization aiming to help the young people. The cultural violence following Johan Galtung have the purpose of legitimate the direct as well as the structural violence as being good and just. It has a clear purpose, effective harming indirectly through words and pictures. It is doing so by practicing a violent and aggressive usage of language. And cultural violence can be transmitted via films, TV, forms of music, the internet, the blogs, the Twitter, the Facebook, the YouTube, etc., and other forms of mass media. But it can also be expressed through everyday practice of patronizing and discriminating usage of language, in which certain groups of young people and their families are characterized as primitive, unintelligent, lazy, uneducated, etc., and thereby, so to speak, fertilizing the soil for direct and, not at least, structural violence to come. Some forms of dominations and control can be difficult to realize. And I am here talking about situations where the dominated group, without reflection, accept and approve the domination as a natural condition. In such cases, according to the French sociologist Bourdieu, the dominating party is exercising symbolic violence. The exercising of power, control, and dominance are not recognized as such by the dominated group. Symbolic violence, as a form of indirect violence, is a central concept in understanding how domination, control, unequalness, and oppression can be maintained. And symbolic violence is harmful because it holds down the dominated party in a non-recognized relationship of dominance and dependence. Outreach workers are often involved in conflict resolutions on different levels. And knowledge of the different forms of indirect violence and the ability to realize the violence in concrete cases will help outreach workers in supporting the young people. Advocacy is a type of conflict resolution, and it might well be appropriate in such cases. Advocacy, that is, speaking on behalf of individuals and groups who do not have the resources, the necessary resources, to speak up for themselves. Advocacy might focus on different levels of society, but I think that legislative advocacy aiming to change legal procedures and resolution, and administrative advocacy aiming at changing administrative routines might be important ways of conflict resolution in cases of indirect violence. Outreach work is, as we all know, working for change and must be seen as an important part of a social and psychological process of empowerment of the young people. Some of the main barriers to empowerment is or are in fact the indirect form of violence. And once again, I think it would be wise of us to reflect on whether harming structures and routine might also be found within our own organization aiming to help the young people. Thank you very much.